Mr. YS, and this is a clip on D1 and some of the other parts of it. So our first question is, what is malnutrition? Or mal, like malpractice, it means bad, roughly. It's bad nutrition. And so we can have different types. We might have bad nutrition in terms of obesity, the consumption of too many calories. Could be malnutrition in terms of lacking nutrients. And then there's malnutrition in terms of starvation. The malnutrition could also be nutrition that leads to disease. So increased disease rates. So malnutrition is either a deficiency or it could be an imbalance or excess of nutrients in the diet. It's a consequence of poor diet. So we have starvation, where we might be lacking adequate protein and carbohydrates. But we also have obesity, which is often seen in developing countries as well now, and it's linked to lower socio-economic classes of developed nations as well. And it's a consequence of unhealthy diet with excess fat and excess refined carbohydrates, so excess sugar. Why doesn't everybody become obese then, or why doesn't everybody become too skinny? How do we regulate intake? So our intake of food is regulated by a number of places. We have the stomach down here. The stomach regulates intake. When we get hungry, when there's nothing in the stomach and there's nothing stretching it out, we will get signals going back to the brain, and one of those signals makes us hungry. This hormone is called ghrelin. So ghrelin is to do with increasing our hunger when you've got an empty stomach. The other thing it could do, though, is if the stomach's full and stretching out, we get a signal going back, stretch receptors. And that's going to be a signal to our brain to reduce the appetite. And so the region of the brain that's involved in this is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, which is labelled just here, which is just above the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is receiving signals. The other place it gets signals from your intestines. So as you eat and food goes into your small intestine, you get this hormone which is called PYY336. And PYY336, this decreases your appetite. Now this makes sense because when you eat a little bit afterwards, you feel more full, and this is the effect of PYY336. So the other place that regulates our appetite is our fat tissue. So fat cells are adipocytes, and this adipose tissue, these fat cells, they send a signal back as well. And this is the hormone leptin. Leptin sends a signal and it decreases appetite. So as we gain weight, if our regulatory circuits are working right, we have more fat cells, they increase, which leads to more leptin, which signals the brain to decrease food intake. So what's remarkable about this system is that if you overfeed animals or humans and then let them eat what they want to eat, and it's not with the modern diet, then their weight will stay within a very kind of reasonable range of normal. If you overfeed, after a while, you will just spontaneously go back to a normal weight. And that kind of makes sense, because if you look at most people who are not eating a poor diet with sugar, high levels of sugar or fat in it, and all of the tribes which are studied, which are not having the modern, what's called the modern industrial diet, they don't really have obesity. Obesity doesn't exist. So they're not overweight, they don't have to think about what they eat, they don't have to control their intake. So it's because of all these hormones. Here's our summary. So the appetite control center is found in the hypothalamus of the brain. We get PYY336 from the small intestine, and that decreases appetite. The other thing we get is adipose tissue releases leptin when you have more fat stored, and so that also decreases appetite. So another one that we didn't mention there was the pancreas, which secretes insulin, and this also decreases appetite. And what the appetite control center is it receives all those signals, and then it will reduce appetite, or if you were starving yourself or trying to reduce intake, it will then make you want to increase intake. So here's a summary of those things. So yeah, leptin from adipose tissue decreases intake. Insulin decreases your intake of food, your appetite. Ghrelin from the stomach would increase it. And all of this leads to your hypothalamus summing up your expenditure, how much you're using, your intake, and maintaining energy balance. What are the consequences of being overweight in terms of health impacts? Well, as you gain weight and become, this is people who are obesely overweight for a period of time, one of the first things that can happen is that you can do diabetes, is where, in the case of this one that's linked to obesity, it's type 2. In type 2 diabetes, you have increased levels of blood sugar. And that's because we're ingesting food, which is broken down into sugars and then absorbed into the blood. Now, the pancreas produces insulin to try and get the sugar into cells. So we want to try and move the sugar, the glucose, into cells. What happens with type 2 diabetes is that although insulin is going to the cell and it is binding to receptors, the receptors don't work. So they become less sensitive. And this is linked to being obese. And it's thought to be because of stress caused in cells. This isn't on the exam, but stress in cells, kind of cellular stress due to having excess nutrients to deal with. So if you're continually overeating, having huge portions with lots of sugars and lots of fats, then the cells get overworked, it causes stress, and this leads to changes which mean that the receptors don't work. And so if the receptors don't work, it means that glucose can no longer enter the cells and it gets stuck in the blood. And so we have this high level of blood glucose. So there's high glucose, but there's also high insulin. So it seems like these things, being obese and developing diabetes type 2, they're very linked, and they're linked to an intake of high fat, high sugar diets, excessive calorie intake, and the other thing would be lack of exercise. So people who are consuming these quite unhealthy diets, which it's easy to consume, sugary drinks, high fat, high carbohydrate things like pizza, processed foods, it's quite easy to eat unhealthily. If that's mixed with a lack of exercise, and then there are other genetic factors, then it leads to weight gain, obesity, which can then trigger diabetes type 2. Being obese also seems to be linked to stressing, a kind of inflammation in arteries, which can cause damage to arteries. But the other thing is that if you have diabetes, if you have an excess of sugar, so if we've got lots of glucose in the blood, then water from the surrounding tissues will be drawn in via osmosis. There will be more blood than normal, more water in the blood, and this causes pressure pushing out. So we get high blood pressure from diabetes type 2. And that high blood pressure, the extra pressure, causes more cracks. We get damage to the lining of our arteries. So the arteries get damaged, and as they get damaged, we get white blood cells and cholesterol. It's LDL-C cholesterol go in and cause the development of plaque. So plaques develop. This whole process is called atherosclerosis. So we get atherosclerosis increasing in diabetes type 2, and this leads to coronary heart disease as well as stroke. And over time these arteries so the lining becomes stiffer as well, and they're more likely to potentially burst open, and then this plaque could move and cause a blockage in the artery supplying the brain or the heart, and you could have, from coronary heart disease, you could have a heart attack. The other thing that you could have in your diet as well is maybe if you're intaking too much salt. So if you have a salty diet, a lot of processed food has a lot of salt. So if we have salt in the diet, it does the same thing. We get water moving in via osmosis, causing increased blood pressure. So here's our summary. What are the consequences of being overweight in terms of diabetes type 2 and hypertension? Well, diabetes mellitus, diabetes mellitus is caused by, we think, diets which are rich in fat, refined carbohydrate and sugars, low in fibre, and that can lead to obesity as well as overeating. If you have too much fat and too much sugar, you overeat more frequently, and due to a lack of exercise. There are also genetic factors, so some people develop diabetes type 2 much more easily than others. And so that leads to symptoms of having raised blood glucose. And you might get glucose in the urine. As a result of that, because you're getting water flowing into your arteries, which shouldn't be there, from surrounding tissue, it leads you to feel dehydrated because your cells are losing water. So you feel thirsty and you have large volumes of urine. And the consequences of this are atherosclerosis, so these fatty plaques the depositing of plaques into arteries. It also, because there's more sugar in the arteries, causes, and this is what's leading to more atherosclerosis, raised blood pressure. Now if it's chronic, if it's more than just a raise in blood pressure which is temporary, it's called hypertension. And then because you've got raised blood pressure, you get coronary heart disease, where you get narrowed coronary arteries, which could lead to heart attacks. Also, if you've gained weight, you need a higher cardiac output to supply your body, and that can lead to raised pressure because you have more cells to supply. And also abdominal obesity can lead to more resistance in your blood vessels, and it can increase your blood pressure. Final part is that you could get stiffer arteries and they could become narrower as well, which leads to raised blood pressure. And you could have, if you've got a high salt intake, it would lead to hypertension to increase blood pressure. Here are two different types of starvation, and this is kind of long-term starvation. One's called kwashiorkor, and the other one's called marasmus. So we can think of starvation, what both of these have is they don't have enough intake of calories. In the case of marasmus, it's they don't have enough protein, fats or carbohydrates. They don't have enough of anything. In someone who has kwashiorkor, it's the fact that they don't have enough protein. And the lack of protein, because you're not taking in enough protein of any type, it means that you can't make blood proteins. And because you can't make some of the proteins in your blood, you get this kind of perverse symptom of someone who's starving, which is a big belly. So you get swelling because you can't make blood proteins, and then you get something called edema. Edema is the swelling of the stomach because you don't have enough intake of protein. And so the cure is just to give them more protein. If they have more protein, then it will disappear. And they'll often be lethargic, and they actually don't really want to eat, and they have to be fed quite slowly. In marasmus, it's both proteins and calories and everything, and they don't get edema. So what's happening in a person who's starving is that first of all, you're going to start breaking down all of your glycogen. You're going to break down body tissue, but first you're going to break down glycogen, which is the store of sugars. This is the store of sugars, which is in your liver and muscle. And when you've used up all of that, then you're going to switch to your fat stores. But when all of your fat goes, then you're going to start breaking down your muscle tissue and using the amino acids for respiration. But that means that you lose muscle mass, and this kind of starvation would be marasmus, where you're breaking down everything because you have inadequate calories. If you have a diet which, for instance, was only carbohydrate, so you're only eating kind of staple carbohydrate like rice, then that could lead to the other form, which is kwashiorkor, where you don't have enough protein. If we have a look here, this is a success story in terms of battling a disease of self-starvation. And so what we can see here is someone who is very, very, very thin. And this is as a result of anorexia, which is a psychological disorder where people reduce their food intake. And so they're having the same symptoms as someone who might be developing marasmus in terms of losing weight. And so some of the symptoms of anorexia, where you believe that you are overweight and keep reducing your food intake, and it might be linked to bulimia as well, with regurgitating food, vomiting it up and not taking it in, is that you start to have You can start to have really yellow and dry skin. You can start to lose your bone mass. You can become constipated. Your hair becomes thin, and actually they can have this kind of layer of hair. So here's our summary. So anorexia is a term meaning reduced appetite, and it's a psychological or psychiatric illness with causes that are very complex and not fully understood. So it's voluntary starvation. You choose to, and you lose your body mass, you lose your fat mass, your hair becomes thinner, so you get this thin hair which can drop out, you get dry skin, you bruise really easily, and you get this fine growth of hair. Eventually, if you've broken down all your fat, or almost all of your fat, you then start to go for the protein. And so we have protein in muscle. So if it's very severe, eventually you will break down the protein in the heart muscle, and that can lead to heart failure and unfortunately to death. Because you don't have as many blood proteins as well, and because of the effects of starvation, you can get really reduced blood pressure and a low heart rate and reduced heart output. And that can also eventually lead to coma and death. Here we have a guinea pig. Now, what do guinea pigs have in common with humans? Well, the thing that we have in common with them, which is kind of weird, is that neither of us can make vitamin C. So we, together with guinea pigs and also with the great apes and a few other organisms, we can't make vitamin C. So the guinea pig was a good model because in animal testing, when they were trying to figure out what was required, we could test them and stop feeding them things containing vitamin C, and then they developed scurvy. So the poor guinea pigs developed scurvy. Now, when they tried it before with rats and mice, it didn't work. So we thought that maybe humans were the only organisms that needed vitamin C. And so we need vitamin C to make healthy cell membranes and connective tissue, like collagen. So without it, we start to get sores and bleeding gums, and we get the symptoms of the disease, scurvy. Here's our summary of using the guinea pig. So it was a model to study the causes and consequences of scurvy. And it was thought to be specific to humans because we couldn't do it in rats and mice. It was unsuccessful because they can synthesize it themselves. But they caused scurvy in guinea pigs by only giving them whole grains without giving them any kind of fruit or vegetables, and they got sores on their skin, dermatitis. So it showed as well they could avoid this if they modified the diet and they gave them fresh cabbage and lemon juice, then the scurvy went away. And that's because these two things contain vitamin C. So they could induce the deficiency, and then they could return them to normal. And so it led to identification of the factors that lead to scurvy. There's a strange genetic disease which is called phenyl ketonuria. Luckily, we can just call it PKU. So PKU, it's a genetic disease, so it's inherited. And what it means is that when we take in proteins contain, they're made up of amino acids. And those amino acids, one of the amino acids is this, PHE, which is a mouthful. It is phenylalanine. Phenylalanine. So phenylalanine can be used, it can be changed into other amino acids. And so if we follow the pathway, if you have a lot of phenylalanine, you don't want it to get up into too high amounts, because anything in high amounts can be toxic. And so normally, in a healthy person, the phenylalanine, with the help of this enzyme, phenylalanine hydroxylase, will be converted into tyrosine. And then the tyrosine will be used and converted, and it means that there's no toxic buildup of phenylalanine. But in someone with PKU, they don't have that enzyme. So now we're shutting down this pathway to get rid of phenylalanine. So while some of the phenylalanine will be used to make proteins, if you take too much of it in the diet, then it will increase, we'll get more and more accumulating to toxic levels, and it then causes issues. And so the disease PKU is about a toxic accumulation of phenylalanine. PKU is phenylketonuria. It's a recessive genetic disease, so you have to get 2 faulty copies of the gene. And it's caused by mutations in a gene coding for an enzyme, which is phenylalanine hydroxylase. It converts phenylalanine into tyrosine. But it's faulty, so you get increased levels of phenylalanine. So these high levels of phenylalanine cause, the symptoms are reduced growth of the head, so small head, small brain, and leads to mental retardation, severe learning difficulties, hyperactivity and seizures. So the treatment, what's the treatment? You test at birth to identify. So this happened with my kids, they get tested for PKU. Tested at birth using a blood test, and they test for, if there's high phenylalanine, then it could be an indication of PKU, and then they'll do a genetic test. So the treatment is basically eating a diet very low in phenylalanine, and that's really, really difficult because phenylalanine is in meat, fish, nuts, cheese, peas, beans. So lots of good stuff, and so you just have to reduce your intake of all those things, and only them in really small quantities. There are also some drugs which can allow you to maybe eat more phenylalanine, but they don't work well in everybody. Okay, this is the final thing we'll look at. So try and see if you can work out what this graph is showing. And let's zoom in and have a look at the axes. So on the y-axis, we've got this. We've got CHD events. And so CHD is coronary heart disease. And events means things to do with coronary heart disease. So it includes things like heart attacks, and I think it also probably includes things like angina, pain in the chest, which usually comes before, is kind of a pre-heart attack symptom. And down on this axis we've got LDL cholesterol. So what's the relationship? All of these different things, these are different studies which are being used to help correlate these two variables. So I think we can see it's a fairly strong positive correlation. As we increase LDL cholesterol, this is low density lipoprotein cholesterol, aka bad cholesterol. It's known as the bad cholesterol. And what it is it's fat. We've got fat inside a phospholipid layer. So it's how we transport fat. Inside there is both, there's fats and there's cholesterol. So you can do a blood test and you can see how much have you got of this stuff floating around, how much LDL-C is there. And what they found is that people who have very high levels of this LDL-C cholesterol also have a much higher level of coronary heart disease. And so from this correlation, they started to think that anything which contained fat, saturated fatty acids, or cholesterol was going to increase. So if you increase those in the diet, saturated fat, if you increase cholesterol in the diet, you would then increase the blood cholesterol. And so this is where the recommendations for having low fat, low saturated fat, low cholesterol, not eating too many eggs, this is where all these recommendations came from. So how is blood cholesterol linked to or an indicator of coronary heart disease? Well, there's a correlation between high LDL-C, LDL cholesterol, and coronary heart disease. There is also a correlation between saturated fats and cholesterol. So high LDL-C can be an indicator of whether you're going to get coronary heart disease. And so the issues, the research has looked at total blood cholesterol, but actually it's only LDL-C which is implicated in it. What they found though is that for people who reduce cholesterol, it actually has a very small effect on blood cholesterol. So they were hoping that decreased dietary cholesterol would lead to a very much decreased blood cholesterol level. But this didn't really happen. And one of the reasons is that the liver makes cholesterol. And it seems that genetic factors might be more important, and some people with chronically high cholesterol diet is not going to make a huge difference in that. They found that drugs are more effective, and so in particular these drugs, although it's not on the exam, these are called statins, and they're now one of the most prescribed drugs in the world because they reduce cholesterol and they seem to reduce blood pressure as well, and they reduce coronary heart disease. So the other thing that could be protecting you is high HDL. HDL-C is high density lipoprotein. It's known as good cholesterol. And when you have high HDL-C from things like olive oil, and some people it's genetic as well, then it seems to protect you against getting coronary heart disease. Now back up here, the IB like the idea that if you increase saturated fatty acids in the diet, that it causes an increase in blood cholesterol, but actually the link is very weak between these. But this is a marking point. So saturated fatty acids, the idea that they cause an increase in blood cholesterol. And that's the end.